Emma's blood ran cold as the marriage broker slashed her bride price in half and declared her used goods to a room of leering men. The battle-scarred colonel, who unexpectedly bid twice the original amount, became either her salvation or her final destruction. Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and comment where in the world you're watching from. Let's go. The frost-laden wind cut through Emma Caldwell's threadbare shawl as she stood on the wooden platform of Willow Creek Station. Winter had arrived early in Colorado Territory, 1867, much like the misfortune that had shadowed her these past 2 years. She clutched her small carpetbag tighter, her knuckles white with cold and tension. The westbound train was late, and with each passing minute, her resolve threatened to crumble, like the dried leaves skittering across the platform. "Last call for mail-order arrangements," bellowed Mr. Holloway, the marriage broker, from his makeshift office inside the station house. His voice carried the practiced enthusiasm of a man who had matched countless desperate women with unknown men for a tidy profit. "Final papers to be signed before departure." Emma swallowed hard and turned toward the weathered building. This was her last chance, her only chance. At 23, she was already considered a spinster, and worse, damaged goods. No respectable man in Millfield would court her now, not after what happened with Thomas Mercer. The station house was warm but stifling, smelling of coal smoke and too many bodies in too small a space. 3 other women huddled near the stove, their faces flushed with heat and anticipation. Unlike Emma, they chatted excitedly about their prospective husbands, comparing descriptions and promises in letters they'd received. "Mr. Holloway," Emma said quietly, approaching his desk, "I've come to finalize my arrangement." The portly man glanced up, recognition dawning slowly in his rheumy eyes. "Ah, Miss Caldwell, I was beginning to think you'd changed your mind." He shuffled through a stack of papers. "Your situation is unique, as I'm sure you understand." The words stung, though she'd heard worse. Behind her, the whispers had already begun. "That's her. The Caldwell girl, the one who was promised to Thomas Mercer, found in the barn with the blacksmith's son. Ruined, completely ruined." Emma fixed her gaze on the contract before her, refusing to acknowledge the gossip that had haunted her for nearly 2 years. What had happened was not as they said, but the truth mattered little in a town that preferred its stories salacious and its judgments swift. "Now, Miss Caldwell," Mr. Holloway continued, his voice lowered conspiratorially, "as I explained before, given your circumstances, the standard bride price has been adjusted. Mr. Sullivan has agreed to accept you with a reduced dowry payment, which your uncle has provided." He tapped a bony finger on the document. "Rather generous of Mr. Sullivan, if I may say so. Most men in the territories want unsullied goods." Emma's cheeks burned. "I understand," she whispered, though the injustice of it all made her throat tighten. $500, that's what her virtue had been worth before. Now, she was being sent west for a mere $150, like damaged merchandise on a shopkeeper's clearance table. "Your intended is a mine owner in Silver Gulch, widowed, no children, 43 years of age, comfortable circumstances." Mr. Holloway recited these facts as if reading a livestock inventory. "Sign here, please." The quill trembled in Emma's hand as she signed away her future to a stranger who would forever consider her a bargain, a compromise. But what choice did she have? After her parents' death from the fever, her uncle had made it clear she was an unwelcome burden. The incident with Daniel, the blacksmith's son, innocent as it had been, had given her uncle the perfect excuse to wash his hands of her. "Train's coming!" someone shouted from outside. Mr. Holloway stamped the papers with practiced efficiency. "That's that. Then, good luck to you, Miss Caldwell." He handed her a sealed envelope. "Your marriage certificate and remaining instructions. Mr. Sullivan's representative will meet you in Denver." Emma tucked the envelope into her reticule and stood, suddenly lightheaded. This was real. She was leaving everything she knew, bound for a place she'd never seen, to marry a man who had agreed to take her only because she came at a discount. The platform was alive with activity now, travelers gathering their belongings as the train approached, belching clouds of steam against the grey November sky. Emma took her place in line, the weight of her decision settling over her like the approaching clouds, promising more snow. Emma Caldwell? The voice was deep, weathered, and somehow familiar. Emma turned to find herself looking up at a tall figure in a Union Army greatcoat, the collar turned high against the cold. For a moment, she didn't recognize him. The silver streaking his once dark hair, the deep lines etched around his eyes, the jagged scar that ran from his right temple to the corner of his mouth. But those eyes, steel blue and intense, she would know anywhere. Colonel Blackwood, she gasped. Colonel James Blackwood, her father's oldest friend, who had dined at their table countless times before the war, who had taught her to ride when she was 12, who had gone off to fight with her father, but unlike her father, had returned. "I thought that was you," he said, his expression softening with what might have been relief. "What in God's name are you doing here?" Before she could answer, the train let out a piercing whistle as it pulled into the station. The crowd surged forward, separating them momentarily. When the colonel reappeared at her side, his face had hardened into something like anger. "You're one of Holloway's brides," he stated flatly, nodding toward the envelope clutched in her gloved hand. It wasn't a question. Emma lifted her chin, determined not to show shame, though it coursed through her veins like ice water. "Yes," she said simply. "I'm to marry a Mr. Sullivan in Silver Gulch." Colonel Blackwood's jaw tightened visibly beneath his neatly trimmed beard. "Edward Sullivan. I believe so, yeah. Christ," he muttered, then immediately apologized for his language. "Miss Caldwell, Emma, Edward Sullivan is no fit husband for any woman, least of all Judge Caldwell's daughter." The conductor called for boarding, his voice carrying over the crowd. Emma felt panic rising in her throat. "I have no choice, Colonel," she said, her voice breaking despite her efforts. "No one else will have me now. I'm considered—" She couldn't bring herself to finish. "Used goods," he supplied grimly. "Yes, I heard the rumors when I arrived in town yesterday. I never believed them." Emma blinked back, sudden tears. "It doesn't matter what's true, only what people believe." "Final boarding," called the conductor. Colonel Blackwood made a decision then, his eyes never leaving hers. "Don't get on that train, Emma." "I must. My contract is worth less than the paper it's written on." His voice was steel and certainty. "Sullivan's mine is failing. He's seeking brides with dowries to prop up his operation. You'll be penniless and trapped within 6 months." Emma stared at him, her world tilting once again. "How do you know this?" "Because I've spent the last year working for the Treasury Department, investigating mining fraud in the territories." He held out his hand. "Give me the contract." Stunned, Emma handed over the envelope. Colonel Blackwood broke the seal and scanned the document, his expression darkening with each line. $150, he read, disgust evident in his tone. They valued Judge Caldwell's daughter at $150. Emma felt stripped bare, her humiliation complete. "Please," she whispered. "The train, you're not getting on it." His voice brooked no argument. "Not to meet this fate. Then what am I to do?" Desperation made her voice sharp. "My uncle won't have me back. I have nowhere to go, no means to support myself." The train whistle blew one final time. Around them, the platform began to empty as the last passengers boarded. Colonel Blackwood looked down at her, his scarred face solemn in the fading afternoon light. "Marry me instead," he said quietly. Emma was certain she had misheard. "What? Marry me," he repeated more firmly this time. "I have a ranch near Denver. It's not much yet, but it's growing. I need a wife, and you need a husband who will respect you." "But why would you?" "Because I know your worth, Emma Caldwell," he said simply, "and it's far greater than any price these fools have set." The train began to move, wheels grinding against steel rails. Emma stood frozen, the colonel's words ringing in her ears. In his eyes she saw no pity, only determination and something else, a warmth she had not encountered in a very long time. "Colonel, James," he corrected gently. "My name is James." As the train pulled away from the station, gathering speed as it headed west without her, Emma made her choice. She placed her small hand in his large, calloused one. "Yes," she whispered, and for the first time in 2 years, hope flickered to life in her heart. "Yes, James." The justice of the peace's office was little more than a cramped corner of the town hall, warmed inadequately by a small coal stove that hissed and popped in the corner, Emma sat rigidly in a straight-backed chair, her hands folded tightly in her lap, her mind still struggling to grasp the swift turn her life had taken in just 3 hours. "Are you certain about this, Miss Caldwell?" Mr. Patterson, the wizened justice, peered at her over wire-rimmed spectacles. "Colonel Blackwood has explained your predicament, but marriage is not a decision to be made in haste." Emma glanced at James Blackwood, who stood by the window, his tall frame silhouetted against the fading winter light. He had maintained a respectful distance since their conversation at the train station, giving her every opportunity to reconsider. "I am certain," she replied, surprised by the steadiness in her voice. "Colonel Blackwood and I are well acquainted. He was my father's dearest friend." Mr. Patterson nodded, though his expression remained doubtful. "And the matter of the prior contract?" James turned from the window. "I've settled it," he said simply. Emma's eyes widened slightly. "Settled it? How?" "I paid Mr. Holloway $200 to void your arrangement with Sullivan." His tone was matter-of-fact, as if he were discussing the purchase of livestock. 200. Emma felt the blood drain from her face. "But that's more than the original price. Colonel, I cannot possibly allow you to—" "James," he corrected again, with the hint of a smile. "And it's done. Emma, consider it a wedding gift." Mr. Patterson cleared his throat. "Well then, if there are no other impediments," he shuffled through the papers on his desk. "I'll need witnesses." "I've arranged for 2, James replied, moving to open the door. To Emma's surprise, Dr. Winters and his wife entered the small office. The doctor had treated her father during his final illness, and Mrs. Winters had always been kind to Emma at church functions, even after the scandal. "My dear," Mrs. Winters said warmly, taking Emma's cold hands in her own. "When the Colonel explained everything, we were delighted to stand for you. Are you well?" Emma managed a small nod, overwhelmed by this unexpected kindness. Dr. Winters clapped James on the shoulder, the two men exchanging a look that suggested some prior conversation Emma had not been privy to. The ceremony itself was brief and oddly dreamlike. Emma heard herself repeating vows, felt the surprising weight of a simple gold band sliding onto her finger. James must have purchased it that afternoon, and then it was done. Mrs. Winters embraced her, whispering congratulations, while the men shook hands. Mr. Patterson presented them with their marriage certificate, the ink barely dry. "I've taken the liberty of arranging rooms at the hotel," James told her as they stepped outside into the cold evening air. "We'll leave for Denver tomorrow morning." Emma nodded mutely, suddenly shy in the presence of this man who was now her husband, a husband who had paid more than the original bride price for a woman the town considered ruined. "You must be hungry," he continued, offering his arm. "The hotel dining room is decent." The Royal Hotel was the finest establishment in Willow Creek, a place Emma had not entered since her family's fall from prominence after her father's death. She felt the stares as James escorted her through the lobby, some curious, others openly disapproving. News traveled fast in small towns. In the dining room, a waiter led them to a corner table, somewhat removed from the other diners. James ordered for both of them with an easy confidence that reminded Emma of her father. "You have questions," he said once they were alone, his perceptive eyes studying her face. Emma looked down at her hands, at the unfamiliar ring that now encircled her finger. "Several," she admitted, beginning with why. "Why would you do this for me, Colonel James?" He was silent for a moment, his scarred face pensive in the soft lamplight. "Your father saved my life at Antietam," he said finally. "Did he ever tell you that?" Emma shook her head. "We were pinned down near the cornfield, shot in the leg. I couldn't move. Union forces were retreating, and the Confederate line was advancing." His voice grew distant, as if seeing it all again. "Judge Caldwell, William, came back for me, carried me a quarter-mile under enemy fire." "That sounds like father," Emma whispered, her throat tight with unexpected grief. "When I received word of his passing, I was in Washington. By the time I could arrange to travel, you had already gone to live with your uncle." James's expression darkened. "Had I known how things stood with you, I would have come sooner." You couldn't have known, Emma said softly. No one could have predicted. What happened with the blacksmith's son, he asked directly, his gaze never leaving her face. Emma stiffened, the familiar shame washing over her. Nothing of the sort they claimed, she said, her voice barely audible. Daniel was teaching me to repair father's pocket watch. He had an aptitude for fine mechanisms. We lost track of time in his father's workshop. When a storm came, we took shelter in the barn until it passed. We were discovered there the next morning, both of us asleep, and that was enough to condemn you, James concluded grimly. Daniel tried to do the honorable thing, offered to marry me. Emma smiled sadly, but his father wouldn't permit it, said no son of his would marry a penniless orphan, no matter the circumstances. Their food arrived, temporarily halting the conversation. Emma found she had little appetite despite having eaten nothing since early morning. And Thomas Mercer? James prompted after the waiter had gone. Your first intended? Broke our engagement immediately. Said he wouldn't risk his good name on damaged goods. The words still had the power to wound, even now. After that, no respectable man in town would consider me. When my uncle suggested the mail order arrangement, you felt you had no choice. James finished for her. Emma nodded, then gathered her courage to ask the question that had plagued her since the train station. And now, what do you expect of this arrangement between us? James considered her question carefully, his expression unreadable. I expect what any man might reasonably want from a marriage. Companionship, someone to help build a home, perhaps children someday. His voice softened. But I also expect to give you time, Emma. Time to know me, to trust me. I'm not unaware that this decision was forced upon you by circumstance. It was my choice. Emma corrected him gently. An unexpected choice, but mine nonetheless. Something in his eyes warmed at her words. And then perhaps we can make the best of it, he said. My ranch is remote. The work is hard, and he gestured vaguely toward his scarred face, not the man I was before the war, but it's a chance for both of us to begin again. Emma studied him across the table, this battle-worn soldier who had stepped into her life so unexpectedly. The scar that ran down his face might have made him fearsome to some, but to her it spoke of survival, of endurance, qualities she desperately needed in her own life. I would like that, she said quietly, a new beginning. Later that night, in the privacy of her hotel room, James had taken a separate room, true to his word about giving her time. Emma stood at the window, watching snow begin to fall on the darkened street below. Tomorrow, she would leave Willow Creek behind, traveling to a new life with a man she barely knew, yet who had shown her more kindness in one day than she had known in 2 years. She touched the marriage certificate that lay on the bedside table, her fingers tracing the words that had transformed her from Emma Caldwell, disgraced spinster, to Mrs. James Blackwood, rancher's wife. Whatever lay ahead, she was no longer alone, no longer used goods with a slashed bride price, but a woman someone had deemed worthy of respect. For tonight, that was enough. Dawn broke cold and clear over Willow Creek as Emma descended the hotel stairs, her few possessions packed in the same carpet bag she had carried to the train station the day before. James waited in the lobby, speaking quietly with the desk clerk. He turned at her approach, his expression softening almost imperceptibly. Did you sleep well?" he asked, taking her bag despite her protests. "Well enough," Emma replied, though in truth she had spent much of the night staring at the ceiling, her mind racing with uncertainty about the future that now stretched before her. James nodded, seeming to understand the lie for what it was. "The stage for Denver leaves in 20 minutes. I've arranged for breakfast to be packed for the journey." Outside, the town was beginning to stir, shop owners clearing snow from their doorsteps, the blacksmith's forge already glowing in the distance. Emma kept her eyes forward, refusing to search for familiar faces among the morning crowd. She had said her goodbyes to this place long before she'd met James at the train station. The stagecoach was already waiting, a sturdy Concorde with 6 horses stamping impatiently in their traces. 2 other passengers huddled nearby, a drummer with his sample cases, and an elderly woman clutching a caged canary. James handed Emma up into the coach before stowing their luggage and joining her inside. As the stage lurched forward, Emma caught a final glimpse of the church spire and the cemetery beyond where her parents lay buried. She had not even been able to visit their graves to tell them of her marriage. The thought brought an unexpected pang of sadness. "We'll return someday if you wish it," James said quietly, following her gaze. "When enough time has passed for the gossip to die." "No," Emma replied, more firmly than she intended. "There's nothing for me here now." The journey to Denver would take the better part of 2 days, with an overnight stop at a way station. The first hours passed in awkward silence, the other passengers dozing or occupied with their own thoughts. Emma stole occasional glances at her husband, still struggling to reconcile this older, battle-worn man with the dashing officer she remembered from her childhood. "You're staring at my scar," James observed mildly, after catching her eye for the 3rd time. Emma flushed. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to." "It's all right," he interrupted, his tone gentle. "Most people either stare openly or pretend not to see it at all. I prefer honest curiosity to false politeness." "How did it happen?" she asked, grateful for the opening to conversation. "Gettysburg." His hand moved unconsciously to his face, fingers tracing the jagged line. "Confederate cavalry." The man had a saber and a remarkably good aim. "The doctor said I was lucky. An inch to the left and I'd have lost the eye." Emma nodded, searching for something appropriate to say. "It must have been painful." A ghost of a smile touched his lip. "The wound, yes, but the laudanum they gave me afterward was worse. Many men never broke free of it." His eyes held a shadow of remembered suffering. "And Dunai was fortunate to have good friends who saw me through those dark days." The stage hit a particularly deep rut, jolting the passengers. James instinctively reached out to steady Emma, his hand warm on her arm. The moment of contact, brief as it was, sent an unfamiliar flutter through her chest. "Tell me about your ranch," she said quickly, eager to dispel the strange tension. James settled back in his seat. "It's about 20 miles outside Denver, in the foothills, 600 acres, mostly grazing land for cattle, with some timber and a good creek running through it. The house is small, 4 rooms, but solid. I've been adding to it these past 6 months. And before that, you mentioned working for the Treasury Department. After the war, I stayed in the army for a time," he explained. "You then took a position investigating mining claims and financial fraud in the Western Territories. That's how I learned about Sullivan and his schemes." His expression darkened momentarily. "When I had saved enough, I purchased the ranch. I was raised on a farm in Pennsylvania. Seems I never lost the taste for open skies and honest work. Do you have help? On the ranch, I mean, 2 hands, brothers named Espinoza who know cattle better than anyone I've met, and Mrs. Perez, who comes 3 days a week to cook and clean." He hesitated. "I didn't want to presume. That is, I wasn't certain what experience you might have with household management." Emma straightened slightly. "I've managed my uncle's household since my aunt's passing last year. Before that, I helped my mother with our home." "I'm not afraid of work, Colonel." "James," he reminded her, with that same hint of a smile. "And I never thought you were." By late afternoon, the mountains had risen before them, majestic and imposing against the western sky. The stagecoach stopped at a small settlement consisting of little more than a way station, stables, and a rustic inn. While James saw to their luggage, Emma found herself standing awkwardly in the inn's small parlor, acutely aware of her travel-worn appearance. The proprietress, a stout woman with apple-red cheeks, approached with a welcoming smile. "You must be Mrs. Blackwood." The colonel telegraphed ahead. "I'm Mrs. Harker." Emma blinked in surprise. "Yes, we were just married yesterday." "Well, congratulations to you both. I've put you in our best room. It even has a proper bathtub. Thought you might appreciate that after a day on the stage." "That's very kind, thank you." Mrs. Harker lowered her voice conspiratorially. "The colonel's been through here regular these past months. Always a gentleman. Always has a kind word." "You've done well for yourself, dear, if you don't mind my saying so." Emma managed a small smile, uncertain how to respond to such familiarity from a stranger. She was saved from replying by James's return. Dinner was served in the inn's small dining room, the food simple but hearty, Afterward, Mrs. Harker showed them to their room, her knowing smile causing Emma's cheeks to flame as the door closed behind them. The room, though plain, was clean and comfortable, with a large bed dominating the space. A copper bathtub stood behind a screen in the corner, steam rising invitingly from the water. James cleared his throat. "Mrs. Harker has prepared a bath for you. I'll give you privacy." He moved toward the door. "Where will you go?" Emma asked, suddenly anxious at the thought of being alone in this strange place. Just downstairs for a while." His voice was reassuring. "Take your time." When he had gone, Emma sank gratefully into the warm water, letting it wash away the dust of travel and the last vestiges of Willow Creek. As she bathed, she tried to make sense of her conflicted emotions, relief at her escape, apprehension about her future, and beneath it all, a growing curiosity about the reserved, honorable man who was now her husband. She had just finished dressing in her nightgown and wrapper when James returned, knocking discreetly before entering. He carried a small package wrapped in brown paper. "I thought you might need this," he said, handing it to her. The general store was still open. Emma unwrapped the package to find a simple hairbrush, comb, and small jar of hand cream. Such ordinary items, yet the thoughtfulness of the gesture brought unexpected tears to her eyes. Thank you," she whispered, unable to say more. James nodded, then retrieved his bedroll from their luggage. "I'll sleep on the floor," he said matter-of-factly, arranging it in the corner of the room. "But the bed is large enough for—" Emma stopped, mortified by her own words. "I meant what I said about giving you time," James replied quietly. "There's no rush, Emma." Later, lying in the darkness with James's steady breathing a few feet away, Emma stared at the ceiling, much as she had the night before. But tonight, her thoughts were different. Instead of fear and uncertainty, she felt something that had been absent for too long, a tentative hope. She had married a stranger, yes, but a stranger who kept his promises, who saw her worth beyond the cruel judgments of others. Perhaps, in time, she might even come to care for him. Perhaps he might come to care for her. Outside, snow began to fall again, blanketing the small way station in silent white. Tomorrow, they would continue their journey to Denver, to the ranch, to their new life together. Whatever waited there, Emma thought as sleep finally claimed her, she would face it with the same courage that had brought her this far. Denver was a revelation to Emma, who had never ventured beyond the modest confines of Willow Creek. The city bustled with energy and purpose, buildings of brick and stone rising alongside rougher wooden structures, streets crowded with wagons, carriages, and people from all walks of life. After the stagecoach deposited them at the central station, James secured a hotel room where Emma could rest while he attended to business matters. "And I need to purchase supplies for the ranch," he explained, "and arrange for transportation. Will you be comfortable here for a few hours?" Emma nodded, secretly relieved for the moment alone to collect herself. The hotel was far grander than anything in Willow Creek, with carpeted hallways and gas lighting. In their room, she washed away the dust of travel and changed into her second-best dress, the best having been worn for her hasty wedding. She had just finished repinning her hair when a knock came at the door. A porter stood outside with a large box. "Delivery for Mrs. Blackwood," he announced, handing it to her. Inside, Emma found a winter coat of fine wool, lined with rabbit fur, practical yet far more elegant than her threadbare shawl. Beneath it lay a pair of sturdy leather boots, fleece-lined gloves, and a knitted scarf and hat. A note in James's precise handwriting read simply, "The ranch is colder than town. These should serve you better than what you have." Tears sprang to Emma's eyes. Such thoughtfulness was unexpected. Her uncle had begrudged every penny spent on her needs. And here was James, a man who barely knew her, anticipating what she would require in her new life. When he returned that afternoon, she thanked him, her voice thick with emotion. "It's nothing," he said, clearly uncomfortable with her gratitude. "Practical necessities, nothing more. Nevertheless, I'm grateful," she replied, "not just for the items themselves, but for the consideration." Something flickered in his eyes. Surprise, perhaps, or pleasure, before he turned to more practical matters. "I've hired a wagon to take us to the ranch tomorrow. We should arrive by nightfall if the weather holds." The journey from Denver into the foothills the next day was arduous but beautiful. The wagon, loaded with supplies, creaked and swayed over the rutted trail as they climbed steadily higher into the mountain. Emma, warm in her new coat, found herself mesmerized by the landscape, towering pines, dramatic rock formations, and glimpses of snow-capped peaks in the distance. "It's breathtaking," she murmured, as they paused to rest the horses beside a swift-flowing creek. "It is," James agreed, his gaze following hers to the mountains. "I've traveled much of this country, but nothing compares to these ranges." He hesitated, then added, "Your father would have appreciated it. He always spoke of bringing your mother west after the war." The mention of her parents brought a pang of bittersweet memory. "He promised to take me to see the frontier when I was a child," Emma recalled. "Before the war changed everything." James nodded, his expression distant. "The war changed all of us," he said quietly. Then, rousing himself, "We should continue if we want to reach the ranch before dark." The sun was indeed setting when they finally turned onto a narrower trail marked by a simple wooden sign, Blackwood Ranch. As they crested a small rise, Emma caught her first glimpse of her new home. The house stood in a protected valley, a sturdy structure of hewn logs with a stone chimney from which smoke curled invitingly. A barn and several outbuildings formed a neat cluster nearby, while fenced pastures stretched toward distant woods. It was smaller than the home she had grown up in, but far more substantial than she had imagined from James's modest description. "And it's lovely," she said, meaning it. "It's a work in progress," James replied, though she caught a note of pride in his voice. "But it's home." As they approached, two men emerged from the barn, the Espinosa brothers, Emma presumed, and a stout, grey-haired woman appeared in the doorway of the house. "Senor Blackwood, you return at last," the woman called, wiping her hands on her apron as she hurried to meet them. She stopped short at the sight of Emma, her eyes widening in surprise. "Mrs. Perez," James said, helping Emma down from the wagon. "Allow me to introduce my wife, Emma Blackwood." The shock on the housekeeper's face might have been comical under different circumstances. "Wife," she repeated, as if unsure she had heard correctly. "Yes," James confirmed, his tone leaving no room for questions. "But we were married in Willow Creek 2 days ago." Mrs. Perez recovered quickly, her weathered face breaking into a warm smile as she took Emma's hands in her own. "Welcome, Senora Blackwood. This is a blessed surprise. Come inside. You must be exhausted from your journey." The house was warm and smelled of fresh bread and wood smoke. Mrs. Perez had clearly been preparing for James's return, though not for the additional guest he had brought. Emma was shown to the main bedroom, a simple but comfortable space with a large bed, chest of drawers, and washstand. A colorful quilt covered the bed, and curtains framed the windows, feminine touches she had not expected in a bachelor's home. "My sister made the quilt," Mrs. Perez explained, following Emma's gaze. "She said the Colonel's house needed a woman's touch." She chuckled. Little did she know how right she was. Left alone to freshen up, Emma removed her coat and hat, surveying what was now her domain. The furniture was solid but plain, the floors swept clean. On the bureau stood a daguerreotype in a silver frame, a younger, unscarred James in his officer's uniform, standing beside a seated man Emma recognized as her father. She lifted it carefully, studying the two faces frozen in time before the war had marked them both in such different ways. Supper that evening was a simple affair of beef stew, fresh bread, and apple pie, served at the kitchen table with Mrs. Perez fussing over them both. James spoke of his trip to Willow Creek, carefully editing the circumstances of their meeting and marriage. Emma, following his lead, smiled and answered the housekeeper's tentative questions about herself with equal care. After Mrs. Perez had gone home to her own cabin nearby, James showed Emma through the rest of the house, the small parlor with its stone fireplace, the study lined with bookshelves, and a fourth room currently used for storage. "I thought this might become a sewing room, or whatever you might need," he said, gesturing to the cluttered space. "And once it's cleared out, of course." "Thank you," Emma replied, touched by his consideration. "It's more than generous." An awkward silence fell between them as they returned to the kitchen. The question of sleeping arrangements hung unspoken in the air. "I'll take the sofa in the study tonight," James said finally. "You've had a long journey. This is your home," Emma protested. "I don't wish to displace you from your own bed." "Our home," he corrected gently. "And it's no hardship. I've slept in far worse conditions." Later, lying in the large bed that smelled faintly of cedar and tobacco, James's scent she realized. Emma stared into the darkness, trying to process the whirlwind of changes in her life. Just 3 days ago, she had been preparing to marry a stranger in a mining town, valued at less than the price of a good milk cow. Now, she was mistress of a ranch, married to a man who treated her with more respect than she had known in years. It was not love, she knew that. Perhaps it never would be, but it was a chance to build something honest and real from the ashes of her old life. As she drifted towards sleep, Emma found herself, for the first time in too long, looking forward to tomorrow. The first week at Blackwood Ranch passed in a blur of activity as Emma settled into her new role. Each morning, she woke before dawn to the sounds of James moving quietly through the house, building the fire and preparing for the day's work. By the time she dressed and entered the kitchen, coffee would be brewing on the stove, though James himself would already be out in the barn. On the third day, Emma rose earlier than usual, determined to have breakfast ready before he left. When James entered the kitchen to find hot biscuits, eggs, and bacon waiting, his surprise was evident. "You didn't need to go to such trouble," he said, taking a seat at the table. "It's hardly trouble," Emma replied, pouring his coffee. "It's what a wife should do." Something flickered in his eyes, an emotion Emma couldn't quite identify. "You're not a servant, Emma." "No," she agreed, sitting across from him with her own plate. "I'm your partner, or at least I'd like to be." James studied her for a moment, then nodded slowly. "I'd like that too." The days quickly fell into a rhythm. Mrs. Perez still came 3 times a week, but Emma gradually took over more of the household duties, grateful to have meaningful work after the idle misery of her uncle's home. She learned to cook on the large cast-iron stove, mastered the temperamental pump that supplied water to the kitchen, and began inventorying the pantry and root cellar, planning for the winter months ahead. James spent most daylight hours working with the Espinosa brothers, tending to the cattle, repairing fences, and making improvements to the outbuilding. He returned each evening tired but seemingly content, and they would share the day's events over supper. Their conversations remained somewhat formal, but grew more comfortable with each passing day. At night, James continued to sleep in the study, though Emma found herself increasingly wondering what it would be like to share the bedroom with him. These thoughts both confused and unsettled her. She had been raised to view marital duties as something to be endured rather than desired, yet she found herself drawn to James in ways she hadn't anticipated. On Sunday morning, James surprised her by appearing at breakfast in his good suit rather than his work clothes. "I thought we might attend services in town," he explained. "If you're willing, of course." The prospect of meeting people from the surrounding area filled Emma with trepidation. "Will there be many others there?" "A fair number. The settlement's growing. The church is small, but Reverend Harper is a good man." James hesitated. It might be easier to make your introductions there than elsewhere. People tend to be on their best behavior in church." Emma nodded, understanding his reasoning. Sooner or later, she would need to meet their neighbors. Better to do so in a controlled setting than to have them arrive at the ranch unannounced. Curious about the colonel's new wife, the small church was indeed nearly full when they arrived. James guided Emma with a gentle hand at her back, nodding to acquaintances as they made their way to an empty pew. Emma felt the weight of curious stares, but kept her chin high, her arm linked through her husband's. Colonel Blackwood, a ruddy-faced man, greeted them, his wife hovering at his elbow. "Didn't expect to see you today. Usually takes Christmas or Easter to get you through those doors." "Mr. Bennett," James replied evenly. "Allow me to introduce my wife, Emma." "Emma, this is Joshua Bennett and his wife, Martha. They run the general store in town." Mrs. Bennett's eyes widened, her gaze darting from Emma to James and back again. "Wife? Well, bless my soul. When did this happen?" "Recently," James answered, his tone polite but offering no further details. Other introductions followed: the blacksmith and his family, the banker and his wife, the school teacher, each with varying degrees of surprise at James's marital status. Emma answered their questions with practiced composure, sharing only that she was from Willow Creek and that, yes, they were very happy. "Thank you for asking." After the service, Several women approached Emma with invitations to quilting circles and social gatherings. Though some of their smiles seemed forced, their curiosity palpable, she accepted graciously, recognizing the importance of establishing herself in the community. "You handled that well," James commented as they drove home. "Better than I did, certainly. I've had practice navigating difficult social situations," Emma replied. "Though I admit, it's easier when the whispers aren't about scandal." "Give them time," James said, his voice hardening slightly. "Someone will eventually connect your maiden name to your father's reputation or hear something from Willow Creek. And when they do," James glanced at her, his jaw set, "then they'll have to contend with me." The promise in those simple words warmed Emma more than her heavy coat. Whatever else was uncertain in their arrangement, she knew James would stand by her. December arrived with howling winds and heavy snow, transforming the ranch into a world of crystalline white. The work changed with the season. Feeding became the primary concern, ensuring the cattle had enough hay to sustain them through the winter months. Inside, Emma turned her attention to making the house more comfortable, sewing new curtains from fabric James brought from town, preserving the last of the autumn vegetables, and filling the long evenings with mending and knitting. James had cleared out the storage room as promised, and Emma had transformed it into a sewing room and private sanctuary. One evening, as she sat working on a quilt, she heard an odd sound from the parlor. Music, she realized with surprise. Drawn by curiosity, she found James sitting near the fire, playing a simple melody on a battered fiddle. He stopped abruptly when he noticed her. "I'm sorry if I disturbed you." "You didn't," she assured him. "I didn't know you played." James looked down at the instrument, almost self-consciously. "Not well. It was my father's. Sometimes in the winter, when the evenings are long." "Please continue," Emma said, settling into a nearby chair. "It's lovely." After a moment's hesitation, he began again, the tune slow and somewhat melancholy. Emma closed her eyes, letting the music wash over her. When he finished, the silence felt companionable rather than awkward. "My mother played the piano," she said softly. "I miss music." James nodded, understanding in his eyes. "What else do you miss?" Emma, the question caught her off guard with its directness. "Books," she admitted. "My father's library was extensive, and conversation, intellectual debate. Father encouraged it, even from me." She smiled sadly. "My uncle considered such discussions inappropriate for women." "Your uncle sounds like a fool," James replied bluntly, setting aside the fiddle. "Your father was immensely proud of your intelligence. He spoke of it often. You knew him well as any man could, I suppose. We met at Harvard. I was studying law before I joined the army." At Emma's surprised look, he added, "Yes, I had a different life planned once. The war changed that, as it did for many. You never returned to it. The law." James touched the scar on his face unconsciously. "Some doors close forever," he said quietly, "but others open in their place." Before Emma could respond, a commotion erupted outside, the sound of galloping hooves and urgent voices. James was on his feet instantly, reaching for his coat and the rifle kept by the door. "Stay inside," he ordered, his voice shifting to one of command, but Emma was already moving to the window. Through the swirling snow, she could make out Miguel Espinosa dismounting from a lathered horse, his face grim in the lantern light. "It's Miguel," she told James. "Something's wrong." James paused at the door. "Stay by the fire. I'll return when I can." Left alone, Emma paced the parlor, anxiety mounting with each passing minute. When the door finally opened again, letting in a blast of frigid air, James's expression confirmed her fears. "What is it?" she asked. "Rustlers," he replied grimly, moving to gather supplies. "They've taken 20 head at least, using the storm as cover. Miguel's brother is tracking them, but we need to move quickly." Emma felt her heart constrict. "You're going after them in this weather?" "I have no choice." His voice was apologetic but firm. "Those cattle represent our livelihood." As he prepared to leave, Emma fought against her rising panic. She had only just found safety with this man. The thought of losing him to rustlers or the killing winter storm was unbearable. "Be careful," was all she could manage to say as he strapped on his gun belt. James paused, seeming to recognize the fear behind her words. In an unexpected gesture, he crossed to where she stood and gently cupped her face in his calloused hand. "I will return," he promised, his voice low and certain. Then, before she could respond, He leaned down and pressed his lips briefly to hers, their first real kiss, simple but achingly tender. Then he was gone, the door closing behind him, leaving Emma standing alone in the warmth of the house, her fingers touching her lips in wonder. The hours after James's departure were the longest of Emma's life. She moved through the house like a restless ghost, unable to settle to any task for more than a few minutes, her mind conjuring increasingly terrible scenarios. Outside, the storm intensified, howling around the eaves and rattling the windows in their frames. By midnight, the wind had reached a fevered pitch, driving snow horizontally across the valley. Emma stoked the fire in the parlor and kept the lamps burning, beacons against the darkness. Sleep was impossible. Instead, she wrapped herself in a quilt and kept vigil by the window, straining to see through the white chaos beyond the glass. The kiss James had given her, brief but unmistakably tender, played again and again in her memory. What had it meant? Was it merely a gesture of comfort in a moment of crisis, or something more? When the knock finally came shortly before dawn, Emma was so exhausted she feared she might have imagined it. But it came again, urgent, demanding, and she rushed to the door, her heart in her throat. It was not James, but Rafael Espinosa, his face etched with exhaustion, snow crusting his eyebrows and mustache. "Senora," he gasped, "the Colonel. He is hurt. We need help." Fear shot through Emma like lightning. "Where is he? How badly?" "At our cabin. Miguel tends him now. The horse. We could not bring him further in the storm." Emma moved with decisive swiftness, gathering bandages, whiskey, her sewing kit, and clean cloths. She threw on her coat and boots, wrapped a scarf around her head, and followed Rafael into the blinding storm without hesitation. The Espinosa brothers' cabin lay half a mile from the main house, a distance that seemed endless as they struggled through knee-deep drifts. The wind cut through Emma's clothing like knives, but she pushed forward, clutching her bundle of supplies. Rafael, seeing her determination, said nothing, only offered his arm for support when the drifts grew too deep. The cabin was small but warm, lit by a single lantern. James lay on a narrow cot, his face alarmingly pale against the rough blanket. Miguel stood as they entered, relief evident in his expression. "He lives," he said simply, moving aside so Emma could approach. "Bullet took him in the shoulder. I have stopped the bleeding." But Emma dropped to her knees beside the cot, her fingers trembling as she touched James's forehead. He was hot, too hot, his skin flushed with fever. Gently, she peeled back the blood-soaked bandage Miguel had applied, revealing an angry wound just below James's left collarbone. "The bullet?" she asked, her voice steadier than she felt. "Still inside," Miguel confirmed. "I tried, but..." He gestured to his own rough hand. Emma took a deep breath. Her father had been a judge, not a doctor, but during the war, he had volunteered at the field hospitals when court was not in session. She had sometimes accompanied him, assisting the nurses. The memories of those grim days flooded back now, the smell of blood and antiseptic, the groans of wounded men, the precise movements of surgeons as they extracted bullets and stitched wounds. "I need more light," she said, her voice taking on a tone of authority that surprised even her. "And water as clean as you have, and whiskey." Rafael hurried to comply while Miguel hovered anxiously. "Ah, you know how to remove a bullet, senora. I've seen it done," Emma replied, rolling up her sleeve. It wasn't exactly a lie. She had watched, though never performed the procedure herself, but she couldn't afford doubt now. "And the Colonel has little choice unless you'd prefer to take him to town in this blizzard." Working methodically, Emma cleaned the wound first with whiskey, then with boiled water. James stirred and moaned, but did not fully wake, which was perhaps a mercy. Using a small knife Miguel had sterilized in the fire, she probed the wound as gently as she could, feeling for the bullet. It was mercifully close to the surface. Having been slowed by James's heavy coat, her fingers slippery with blood, Emma managed to extract the small lead ball, dropping it with a soft clink into a tin cup. Next came the most challenging part, stitching the wound closed. Her hands shook slightly as she threaded the needle, but steadied as she began to sew, each stitch careful and precise. When she finished, she cleaned the area once more with whiskey and applied a fresh bandage. "Now we wait," she said, wiping her bloodied hands on a cloth. "And pray." The storm continued through the day and into the next night, making it impossible to move James to the main house. Emma remained at his side, bathing his fevered brow with cool water, spooning broth between his cracked lips when he was lucid enough to swallow, and changing his bandages regularly. The Espinosa brothers took turns keeping the fire stoked and bringing fresh snow to melt for water. In his delirium, James called out, sometimes in the clipped tones of military command, other times in anguished whispers. He spoke to comrades long dead, to Emma's father, and occasionally to Emma herself, though his fevered mind seemed confused about when and where they were. "Should have told you," he muttered once, his hand gripping hers with surprising strength. "Should have said it before I left." "Told me what?" Emma asked, leaning closer, but he had already slipped back into restless unconsciousness. On the third morning, Emma woke from a brief, exhausted sleep to find James watching her, his eyes clear for the first time since his injury. "Emma," he said, his voice hoarse but steady. "You're here?" Relief washed over her so powerfully she nearly wept. "Of course I'm here," she managed. Where else would I be?" A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "How bad?" "Bad enough," she replied, helping him sip some water. "The bullet's out. You've had a fever, but it broke during the night. You'll recover. With time and rest." James's eyes never left her face, studying her with an intensity that made her self-conscious. She knew she must look a fright, her hair falling from its pins, her dress stained with his blood, dark circles surely visible beneath her eyes. "You removed the bullet?" he asked, seemingly incredulous. Emma nodded. There was no one else. "And the rustlers?" "4 men," came Miguel's voice from the doorway. He approached the cot, relief evident in his weathered face. "2 escaped. 1 is dead. The other we tied and left with the sheriff in town. And the cattle. All recovered, Colonel. They are safe in the south pasture." James closed his eyes briefly, as if gathering strength. When he opened them again, he looked directly at Emma. "Thank you," he said simply, though the words seemed weighted with more meaning than their simplicity suggested. By the 4th day, the storm had finally passed, leaving the world transformed beneath a blanket of pristine white. With the help of the Espinosa brothers, they managed to transport James back to the main house on a makeshift sled. Emma had prepared the bedroom, banking the fire high and turning down the covers. As they settled James into the bed, she couldn't help but note the irony, their first time sharing the room, and he was too injured to sleep elsewhere. That evening, after the brothers had gone and James had taken some soup and bread, Emma sat beside the bed, mending his torn and bloodied shirt by lamplight. "Emma," he said, breaking the comfortable silence that had fallen between them. "Look at me." She set aside her sewing and met his gaze, struck as always by the intensity of his blue eyes. "You saved my life," he said quietly. "The Espinosas did most of the work," she demurred. "I merely—" "No," he interrupted. "Miguel told me what you did. How you came through the blizzard without hesitation. How you removed the bullet and stitched the wound with your own hands." His voice grew softer. He said you never left my side, not even to sleep." Emma felt heat rise to her cheeks. "You would have done the same for me." "Yes," he agreed, "but that doesn't diminish what you did." He reached out with his good arm, his hand finding hers on the quilt. "When I married you, I thought I was rescuing you. It seems you've returned the favor rather quickly." "Perhaps," Emma replied, smiling slightly as she curled her fingers around his. "We are rescuing each other." James's recovery progressed slowly but steadily through the weeks that followed. January settled over the ranch with brutal cold, but inside the house, a different kind of warmth had begun to bloom. The distance that had marked their early days together gradually dissolved as Emma tended to James's wound, read aloud to him during long afternoons, and they talked, really talked, for the first time. "Tell me about Harvard," Emma prompted one evening as she changed his bandages. "How did a farm boy from Pennsylvania end up there?" James smiled faintly. "My mother, she was determined I should have more than my father's life. Taught me to read from the family Bible. Saved egg money for years to buy books." His expression softened with memory. "When the local schoolmaster noticed my aptitude for learning, he recommended me to a benefactor in Philadelphia. who funded scholarships. She must have been very proud when you were accepted. She didn't live to see it, James replied quietly. Fever took her the winter before. But I like to think she knows somehow. Emma's hands stilled on the fresh bandage. I'm sorry. It was a long time ago. He watched her fingers as they resumed their careful work. Your touch has grown quite professional, Dr. Blackwood. The teasing note in his voice, a new development, brought a smile to her lips. Hardly, but the wound is healing well. Another week and you should be able to move about more freely. I'm already going mad with idleness, James admitted. I'm not accustomed to being confined, nor to being cared for, I imagine. Emma observed. Something flickered in his eyes. No, he agreed softly, not since I was a boy. The intimacy of these quiet conversations, more than the physical closeness of nursing him, created a bridge between them that grew stronger each day. Emma found herself looking forward to these moments, when the taciturn man she had married revealed himself in small, precious glimpses. James, too, seemed to relish their talks, asking about her childhood, her education, her dreams before life had narrowed her options so severely. He listened with genuine interest, sometimes challenging her opinions, other times nodding in thoughtful agreement. Never once did he suggest her ideas were inappropriate for a woman, as her uncle had so often done. By the third week of January, James was well enough to move around the house, though Emma insisted he use his arms sparingly. Mrs. Perez, who had been unable to reach the ranch during the worst of the storms, returned to find the dynamic between her employer and his new wife noticeably altered. "Do you look better, Signor?" she observed shrewdly, preparing dinner one evening while Emma worked on mending nearby. "Marriage agrees with you, even with a bullet hole." James coughed uncomfortably, but Emma caught the pleased expression he tried to hide behind his coffee cup. The first test of their newfound closeness came at the end of January, when the weather cleared enough for visitors. Martha Bennett arrived one morning with a basket of preserves and an unmistakable agenda of curiosity. "I've been simply desperate to call on you," she explained as Emma served tea in the parlor. "But Joshua said the pass was too dangerous until now." Her eyes darted around the room, taking in every detail. "How are you finding married life, my dear, and in such rustic circumstances?" "I find it suits me very well," Emma replied evenly. "The Colonel is an excellent husband, and the ranch is becoming more comfortable by the day." Martha murmured, clearly hoping for more revealing confidences. When none were forthcoming, she changed tactics. "You know, we were all quite surprised by the Colonel's sudden marriage. He's been something of a solitary figure since arriving here. There was speculation he might court the widow Carson. Her late husband left her quite well off, but he never showed particular interest." Emma maintained her composed smile. "Sometimes the heart knows its own mind." "Indeed," Martha agreed, though her expression suggested skepticism. She leaned forward slightly, lowering her voice. "I should mention, and I tell you this as a friend, there's been some talk. A letter arrived for Reverend Harper from someone in Willow Creek. Something about your situation before marriage." Ice formed in Emma's veins, though she kept her face carefully neutral. "How interesting that someone would take the trouble to write. People do love their gossip," Martha said, watching Emma's reaction closely, "especially when it involves someone of the Colonel's standing. They're saying you were compromised, that your bride price was reduced because of it." Emma set down her teacup with deliberate care. "Mrs. Bennett, my past is exactly that, the past. Whatever occurred before I met the Colonel is of no consequence to our marriage or to our place in this community." Of course, Martha backpedaled, though her eyes gleamed with the confirmation she clearly believed she'd received. "I only thought you should be prepared. Some of the ladies are particular about their social circle. Then I shall have to hope they judge me by my character rather than by rumors," Emma replied. More tea. When James returned from checking the herd with Raphael, Emma debated whether to mention Martha's visit. In the end, honesty prevailed. "I expected as much," he said grimly after she explained. "News travels, even across mountains." "I'm sorry," Emma said quietly. "Your reputation is of no concern to me," James interrupted firmly, "but yours matters a great deal. If anyone dares to treat you with less than complete respect, I want to know of it." His protectiveness warmed her. But Emma shook her head. "This is a battle I must fight myself, James. If you defend me too forcefully, it only confirms their suspicions." He considered this, then nodded reluctantly. "You're right, of course. But I won't have you facing their cruelty alone." "I won't be alone," Emma replied. "I'll have you beside me." The certainty in her voice seemed to surprise him. He reached across the table, taking her hand in his. "Always," he promised. February brought a gradual thaw, both in the weather and in the physical boundaries between them. James had returned to sleeping in the study once he was well enough to leave their bed, but the memory of their closeness during his recovery lingered. More than once, Emma had woken in the night to find him watching her, his eyes dark with an emotion she was beginning to recognize, but neither of them had yet named. Their first real test came with the Valentine's Day social at the church. Emma had debated whether they should attend, knowing it would expose them to the full scrutiny of the community, but James had been adamant. "Hiding only gives credence to gossip," he reasoned. "Besides, I find I'm rather looking forward to dancing with my wife." The memory of their kiss before the Rustler incident had never been discussed, though it hovered between them like a promise waiting to be fulfilled. The prospect of being held in his arms, even in the formal context of a dance, sent a flutter of anticipation through Emma that both thrilled and alarmed her. The evening of the social, Emma dressed with particular care in her best gown, a deep blue wool that brought out the color of her eyes. She had restyled it with lace from one of her mother's old collars and a sash made from ribbon James had brought from town. As she pinned up her hair, she caught sight of her reflection and paused, surprised by the woman who gazed back at her. The haunted look that had shadowed her eyes in Willow Creek had vanished, replaced by a quiet confidence she had thought lost forever. When she descended the stairs, James was waiting in the parlor, freshly shaved and dressed in his good suit. He turned at her approach, and the expression that crossed his face, admiration mingled with something deeper, more profound, stole her breath. "You are beautiful, Emma," he said simply. "Thank you," she replied, smoothing her skirts self-consciously. "You're quite handsome yourself." James offered his arm, his eyes never leaving hers. Shall we give them something to truly gossip about?" Emma felt a surge of courage as she placed her hand on his sleeve. "Yes," she said with a smile, "I believe we shall." The church hall had been transformed for the Valentine's social, festooned with paper hearts and red ribbons. Oil lamps cast a warm glow over the assembled townspeople, who turned almost as one when Emma and James entered. The brief hush that followed confirmed Emma's suspicions. They were indeed the subject of considerable gossip. James's hand moved to the small of her back, a subtle gesture of support that gave her strength. Head high, Emma smiled and greeted Martha Bennett, who stood near the entrance with her husband. "Mrs. Blackwood, Colonel," Martha said, her eyes darting between them with poorly disguised curiosity. "How lovely that you could join us." "We wouldn't have missed it," Emma replied pleasantly. "The decorations are charming." Reverend Harper approached, his kind face a welcome sight among the scrutinizing gazes. "Colonel Blackwood, we heard about your encounter with those rustlers. God's mercy that you've recovered." "God's mercy and my wife's skill," James corrected, his voice carrying clearly to those nearby. "And Emma removed the bullet and nursed me through the fever. I doubt many doctors could have done better." The Reverend's eyebrows rose in genuine admiration. "Is that so? Remarkable, Mrs. Blackwood." Emma flushed at the praise. "I merely did what was necessary." "Necessity often reveals hidden strengths," the Reverend observed. "I'd say the Colonel is fortunate in his choice of bride." The warmth in his voice seemed to ease some of the tension in the room. Conversations resumed, and a few of the women who had been holding back approached Emma with less reserve than before. A small ensemble began to play, and couples moved to the center of the hall for the first dance. James turned to Emma, extending his hand. "Mrs. Blackwood, may I have this dance?" Taking his hand, Emma allowed him to lead her onto the floor. "Are you certain your shoulder is healed enough?" she whispered as he drew her into the proper position for a waltz. "For this," James smiled down at her, "I'd endure far worse." The music swelled, and they began to move together. Emma had learned the waltz as a girl, but had seldom had opportunity to dance it since her father's death. To her surprise, James was an accomplished dancer, guiding her with confident ease despite his recent injury. "You dance very well, Colonel," she murmured, aware of the eyes following their progress around the floor. "West Point," he explained. Dancing was considered an essential social skill for officers, though I confess it's been some years since I've had cause to demonstrate my abilities. As they circled the floor, Emma caught fragments of whispered conversations. Not what I expected. Carries herself like a lady. See how he looks at her. The last comment sent a rush of warmth to her cheek. How did James look at her? She raised her eyes to his face and found his gaze already on hers, intense and unguarded in a way she had rarely seen. Something shifted between them in that moment, a silent acknowledgement of feelings that had been growing steadily since that first kiss before he left to pursue the rustlers. When the music ended, James reluctantly released her waist but kept hold of her hand. "Punt," he suggested. They made their way to the refreshment table where Mrs. Harper, the Reverend's wife, served them with a warm smile. "You dance beautifully together," she said. "How long have you been married now?" "Just over 2 months," Emma replied. "Such newlyweds. Though I must say, you seem to have the ease of a couple married far longer." Before Emma could respond, a sharp voice cut through the pleasant atmosphere. "Well, isn't this cozy?" Emma turned to find herself face to face with Constance Carson, the widow Martha had mentioned as a potential match for James. She was a handsome woman of perhaps 40, expensively dressed and radiating the confidence of wealth and position. "Mrs. Carson," James acknowledged with cool politeness. "May I present my wife, Emma?" The widow's eyes swept over Emma with undisguised appraisal. "Charmed, I'm sure." Such a surprise to us all when the colonel returned from his trip with a bride, especially one so young. "Age is but a number, Mrs. Carson," Emma replied evenly. "Compatibility of spirit matters far more. Don't you agree?" Something like respect flickered briefly in the older woman's eyes. "Perhaps, though one wonders what spirits could be compatible with our reclusive colonel. He's refused every invitation to my home these past 2 years." "A fortunate refusal," James interjected smoothly, "as it left me free to recognize a far greater treasure when I found it." Mrs. Carson's lips thinned. "Indeed. Though I hear your treasure came at quite a discount. Such bargains are rarely without defects." Emma felt James stiffen beside her, saw his jaw tighten dangerously. Before he could speak, she placed a restraining hand on his arm and addressed the widow directly. "Mrs. Carson, you strike me as a woman who values plain speaking, so allow me to be plain. Whatever you may have heard about the circumstances of my marriage, know this: Colonel Blackwood and I chose each other freely and honorably. The opinions of others, while sometimes entertaining, are ultimately irrelevant to that truth." For a moment, the widow seemed taken aback by Emma's directness. Then, surprisingly, she laughed, a genuine sound without malice. "Well said, Mrs. Blackwood. Few in this town would dare to be so forthright with me." She nodded, almost respectfully. "Or perhaps the colonel has indeed found a worthy match." With that, she moved away, leaving Emma somewhat bewildered by the encounter. "That," James murmured close to her ear, "was masterfully handled." "I wasn't certain it was," Emma admitted. "I half expected her to slap me." Constance Carson respects strength, if nothing else. His hand found hers again, fingers entwining. "I'm proud of you, Emma." The rest of the evening passed more pleasantly than Emma had dared hope. She danced twice more with James and once, at Reverend Harper's request, with the Reverend himself, who used the opportunity to assure her of his support. "Small communities can be quick to judge," he told her kindly, "but they can be equally quick to embrace those who prove their worth. You and the colonel clearly belong together. Anyone with eyes can see it." By the time they left, Emma felt a curious mixture of exhaustion and elation. The scrutiny had been intense, but she had stood her ground with dignity. More importantly, something fundamental had changed between her and James, a new awareness, a current of unspoken feeling that made the air between them almost vibrate with possibility. The drive home through the moonlit night was quiet, both of them wrapped in their own thoughts. The horses' hooves crunched steadily on the snow-packed road, their breath forming clouds in the frigid air. "They'll talk less now," James said finally, breaking the companionable silence. "You've shown them who you are, not who they expected you to be." Emma gazed up at the stars, scattered like diamond dust across the velvet sky. "I'm beginning to remember who I am," she said softly. "Who I was before my father died, before my uncle's house, before Willow Creek's judgment. James glanced at her, his profile strong against the moonlight. And who is that? A woman who speaks her mind, Emma replied thoughtfully, who doesn't shrink from challenges, who believes in the value of her own abilities. She paused. A woman very much like the one my father raised me to be. I see her clearly, James said, his voice low and certain. I've seen her from the beginning. The ranch house came into view, windows dark, waiting for their return. As James helped Emma down from the wagon, his hands lingered at her waist longer than necessary. Standing close in the silver moonlight, Emma felt the familiar flutter in her chest, stronger now than ever before. Would you like some tea before bed? She asked, suddenly shy, though they had shared countless teas over the past month. Very much, James replied, his eyes never leaving hers. Inside, the house was cold and dark. While James lit the lamps, Emma stoked the fire in the parlor and put the kettle on to boil. These simple domestic tasks had become a comforting ritual, but tonight they seemed charged with new meaning. Each movement, each glance between them weighted with unspoken words. When the tea was ready, they sat before the fire, not in their usual separate chairs, but together on the small sofa. The space between them seemed at once vast and infinitesimal. Emma, James began, setting aside his cup. There's something I've been wanting to tell you. Emma's heart quickened at the serious tone in James's voice. What is it? She asked, setting her own teacup aside. James seemed to struggle for words, an unusual circumstance for a man typically so measured in his speech. I've not been entirely forthright with you, he began, his eyes meeting hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. About my reasons for marrying you. A cold knot formed in Emma's stomach. Had there been some ulterior motive after all? Some debt to her father she hadn't known about? She steeled herself, determined to face whatever came next, with the same courage she'd shown at the social. I told you I married you because I knew your worth, James continued. That was true, but incomplete. He took a deep breath. Emma, I've carried your memory with me for years. My memory? She echoed, confused. The last time I saw you before Willow Creek was at your father's house, just before I left for Washington. You were 19, playing the piano in the parlor. Chopin, I think. Your mother was still alive then. Emma remembered that day with startling clarity. Colonel Blackwood James had come to discuss something with her father. She had been practicing in the parlor, not wanting to interrupt their meeting in her father's study. You stopped to listen, she recalled slowly. You stood in the doorway. I was embarrassed to be caught playing so poorly. A ghost of a smile touched his lips. You played beautifully. I remember thinking how grown up you seemed, no longer the child I had taught to ride, but a young woman of grace and intelligence. His voice softened. As in another life, had the war not come, had your father lived. He left the thought unfinished, but Emma understood. In that other life, he might have courted her properly, with her father's blessing. Instead, the war had taken both men away, returning only one, changed forever by what he had seen and endured. When I received word of your father's death, James continued, I wrote to you. Did you ever receive my letters? Emma shook her head, stunned by the revelation. No, my uncle must have. He was very strict about my correspondence. I feared as much. When no response came, I assumed you wished no contact with reminders of your father's life before the war. His hand found hers on the sofa between them. And then I saw you at that train station, about to be bartered to a man who could never value you properly. And I knew I couldn't let it happen. So you married me out of obligation to my father, Emma said softly, trying to keep the disappointment from her voice. No, James replied firmly. I married you because in that moment, seeing you again after all those years, I realized I had never forgotten you. The obligation to your father gave me the right to intervene, but my decision to offer marriage instead, he paused, seeming to gather his courage. That came from a more selfish place. Emma's pulse raced as she searched his face. Selfish? I wanted you in my life, Emma. not as a charity case or as a duty to be fulfilled, but as my wife in truth. His fingers tightened around hers. I know our beginning was unconventional. I know I promised to give you time, but these past months, watching you build a life here, seeing your strength and grace in the face of adversity, I find myself hoping for more than the arrangement we agreed upon. The fire crackled in the hearth, casting a warm glow over them both as Emma absorbed his words. All this time, she had believed herself rescued on a whim, valued only because James had seen past the town's judgment to her inherent worth, to learn that he had carried thoughts of her for years, that he had tried to reach out after her father's death, that his offer of marriage had been motivated by personal feeling as well as honor. It was almost too much to comprehend. "James," she began, her voice barely above a whisper, "are you saying—" "I'm saying that I love you, Emma," he interrupted, the words tumbling out as if he feared losing his nerve. "I believe I have loved you since that day in your father's house, though I had no right to such feelings then. And I am saying, with all the humility I possess, that I hope you might someday come to love me too." Emma stared at him, this scarred, honorable man who had saved her from a life of misery and given her a home where she could rediscover herself. The man who had respected her boundaries, valued her opinions, and defended her honor without diminishing her own strength. The man whose rare smiles had become precious to her, whose companionship had filled the empty spaces in her heart. "James," she said again, her voice steadier now, "I don't need someday." His brow furrowed in confusion. Before he could speak, Emma leaned forward and pressed her lips to his in a kiss born of certainty rather than impulse. For a moment, James remained perfectly still, as if afraid any movement might shatter the moment. Then his arms came around her, drawing her closer as he returned the kiss with a tenderness that made her heart ache. When they finally parted, Emma remained within the circle of his arm. "I love you now," she said simply, not out of gratitude or obligation, but because of who you are, who we are together. The smile that transformed James's face then was like sunrise breaking over the mountains, radiant, powerful, illuminating the strong features that had become so dear to her. The scar that cut across his cheek, once fearsome, now seemed merely a part of him, as essential as his blue eyes or the gentle strength of his hands. "When did you know?" he asked, tracing the curve of her cheek with reverent fingers. "I think it began the day you left to pursue the rustlers," Emma admitted. "The fear I felt when you rode away, it wasn't just concern for my future or my security. It was terror at the thought of losing you specifically. By the time I found you wounded in the Espinosa's cabin, I could no longer deny what my heart already knew." James pulled her closer, his forehead resting against hers. "We've wasted so much time." "Not wasted," Emma corrected gently. "We needed this time to know each other, to build trust, to be certain. And now," his voice held a question beyond the simple words. Emma smiled, her heart lighter than it had been in years. "Now we begin again, not as a colonel and a disgraced judge's daughter, not as rescuer and rescued, but as husband and wife in truth." That night, for the first time, they shared the bedroom not out of necessity due to injury, but as a married couple in every sense. James's touch was gentle, reverent, as he showed Emma that physical love could be a joy rather than a duty. In his arms, she discovered parts of herself long dormant: passion, desire, a capacity for pleasure she had never imagined during her sheltered upbringing or her years under her uncle's oppressive roof. Afterward, lying with her head on his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart, Emma felt a profound sense of peace. Outside, the wind had picked up, rattling the windows and moaning around the eaves, but within their room all was warmth and contentment. "What are you thinking?" James asked, his fingers trailing lazily through her unbound hair. "I was thinking about worth," Emma replied, "about how people tried to quantify mine with a bride price, how they reduced it when they deemed me damaged." James's arm tightened around her. "They were wrong, yes," she agreed, "but not because they valued me too little, because they tried to assign a value at all." She propped herself up on one elbow to look at him. "Love can't be measured in dollars, can it? It exists beyond price." "Far beyond," James agreed, drawing her down for another kiss. As February gave way to March and the first hints of spring began to soften the harsh mountain landscape, Emma and James settled into their new reality as a truly married couple. The change in their relationship was subtle to outside eyes, but profound within the walls of their home. They still worked side by side during the day, James with the run, Emma with the household. But now there were stolen kisses in the kitchen, lingering touches as they passed each other, and nights spent wrapped in each other's arms. Their happiness might have continued undisturbed had the past not come calling on a blustery March afternoon in the form of a letter delivered by the weekly mail coach. The letter bore the Willow Creek postmark and was addressed to Colonel James Blackwood in an unfamiliar hand. Emma watched as James opened it, her stomach tightening with foreboding. The happiness they had found felt suddenly fragile, threatened by this intrusion from the past. James's expression darkened as he read, his jaw tightening in that way Emma had come to recognize as controlled anger. "What is it?" she asked, unable to bear the suspense. He hesitated, then handed her the letter. "It's from Thomas Mercer." Emma's hands trembled as she took the paper. Thomas Mercer, her former fiancé, the man who had so publicly rejected her after the scandal, calling her damaged goods, within earshot of half the town. She had not allowed herself to think of him in months. The letter was brief but pointed. "Colonel Blackwood, it has come to my attention that you have married Miss Emma Caldwell, formerly engaged to me. I feel it my Christian duty to inform you that you have been deceived. The woman has a history of impropriety that made her unsuitable as a wife for any gentleman of standing. I broke our engagement upon discovering her secret meetings with the blacksmith's son, meetings that no virtuous woman would countenance. While I have established myself with a respectable wife in Denver and have no personal interest in this matter, I could not in good conscience allow another man to be duped. If you wish to discuss this situation, I can be found at the Denver National Bank, where I now serve as assistant manager. With sincere concern, Thomas Mercer." Emma's cheeks burned with humiliation and anger. "He's in Denver," she whispered, "and he's spreading his lies there now." James took the letter back, his expression unreadable. "But do you wish me to respond? What would you say?" "That depends," he replied carefully, "on what you want. Emma, I could ignore it. I could write a response that would wither his self-righteousness on the vine, or," he paused, his eyes meeting hers steadily, "I could call on him in person and set the record straight." Emma considered her option, a familiar shame threatening to overwhelm her. Then she remembered her behavior at the Valentine's social, how she had faced down Constance Carson's barbs with dignity, how she had danced with her head held high despite the whispers. She was not the same frightened girl who had fled Willow Creek. "I want to face him," she said finally. "Together." James's eyebrows rose in surprise. "You're certain?" "Yes." Her voice grew stronger with conviction. "I've spent too long allowing others to define me by their lies. It's time I reclaimed my own story." 2 days later, they rode into Denver together. Emma wore her best dress, a new one James had insisted on purchasing during their last trip to town, and carried herself with the quiet confidence of a woman secure in her husband's love and her own worth. The Denver National Bank was an imposing structure of red brick and polished brass, designed to inspire confidence in its solidity. Inside, the marble floors echoed with their footsteps as they approached a young clerk. "We're here to see Mr. Thomas Mercer," James stated, his military bearing evident in his straight posture and clear voice. The clerk nodded respectfully. "Of course, sir. And whom shall I say is calling?" "Colonel and Mrs. Blackwood." As they waited in a small anteroom, Emma smoothed her skirts, fighting the flutter of anxiety in her chest. James covered her hand with his own, offering silent support. Thomas Mercer had changed little in the 2 years since she'd last seen him, still handsome in that polished, somewhat bloodless way, with thinning blonde hair and pale eyes that widened visibly when he recognized Emma. "Colonel Blackwood," he recovered quickly, extending his hand. "This is unexpected." "Is it?" James replied coolly, ignoring the outstretched hand. "You invited discussion in your letter." Thomas's gaze flicked nervously to Emma, then back to James. "I hardly expected you to bring her. Perhaps we might speak privately, man to man." "My wife and I have no secrets," James said firmly. "Anything you wish to say can be said in her presence." The banker's lips thinned with displeasure. "Very well. I assume you received my letter of concern." "Your letter of slander, you mean?" Emma interjected, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "You've been spreading the same lies in Denver that you perpetuated in Willow Creek." "Lies?" Thomas's expression hardened. "You were found alone with Daniel Cooper in his father's barn. The entire town knew of it." "Yes, I was," Emma acknowledged, lifting her chin, "seeking shelter from a storm after he had been teaching me to repair my father's pocket watch. Nothing more occurred. As I told you then, no virtuous woman would place herself in such a compromising position," Thomas insisted. "I had my reputation to consider, my position in the community." "As do I," James said quietly. "Which is why I'll thank you to cease spreading malicious gossip about my wife." Thomas's face flushed an unflattering shade of red. "I merely thought to warn you." "No," Emma interrupted, finding strength in James's steady presence beside her. "You sought to hurt me one last time, to prove to yourself that your rejection was justified, that I was somehow deserving of the cruelty you and the rest of Willow Creek inflicted." The banker stiffened, his expression defensive. "You can hardly blame me for protecting myself from scandal." "I don't blame you for ending our engagement," Emma replied calmly. "I thank you for it. Had you not rejected me so thoroughly, I might never have found true happiness with a man of genuine honor and character." James's hand found hers, their fingers entwining in silent solidarity. Thomas looked between them, clearly taken aback by Emma's transformation from the broken, desperate girl he had once dismissed. "I see you've convinced your husband of your innocence," he said stiffly. "I wish you both well in your arrangement." "It's not an arrangement, Mr. Mercer," James corrected, his voice deceptively gentle. "It's a marriage based on mutual respect, trust, and love, concepts I suspect are foreign to you." He stepped closer, his scarred face inches from the banker's. "Now, I'm going to say this once, and I expect to be understood. You will never again speak or write of my wife. If I hear that you have mentioned her name in any context, I will return to Denver, and our next conversation will be far less civilized." Thomas blanched, taking an involuntary step backward. "Is that a threat, Colonel?" "It's a promise," James replied simply, "from a man who keeps his word." The ride home from Denver was quiet but peaceful, the mountains gradually reclaiming their place on the horizon as they left the city behind. Emma felt a curious lightness, as if confronting Thomas had lifted a weight she hadn't fully realized she carried. "You were magnificent," James said finally, breaking the comfortable silence between them. "I've seen men face cannon fire with less courage than you showed today." Emma smiled, warmed by his praise. "I had you beside me. That makes all the difference." "No," he corrected gently, "the difference is in you. You've reclaimed yourself, Emma. The woman you were always meant to be." As the ranch came into view, bathed in the golden light of late afternoon, Emma felt a surge of gratitude for the strange twist of fate that had brought her to this place, to this man. What had begun as an escape from shame had become a journey toward love and self-discovery. That evening, as they sat together on the porch, watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of amber and rose, Emma rested her head on James's shoulder, his arm warm around her waist. "I received a letter today as well," she said quietly, "from Dr. Winters's wife." James looked down at her curiously. "Do. She writes that my uncle has been telling anyone who will listen that you paid $200 to void my contract with Sullivan, twice the reduced bride price. Does that trouble you?" James asked, his voice careful. Emma shook her head, smiling up at him. "Not anymore. Let them talk about prices and worth and damaged goods. We know the truth." "And what is that truth, Mrs. Blackwood?" James murmured, his eyes soft with love. That some things can't be measured or priced," Emma replied, taking his scarred face between her hands. "That sometimes what others see as flaws are exactly what make us valuable to the right person. And that love, real love, sees beyond the surface to the heart beneath." As the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, Emma thought of how far she had come from that cold train platform in Willow Creek. The woman who had stood there, clutching her carpetbag and her damaged reputation, could never have imagined the life that awaited her, a life not of mere security or respectable compromise, but of passion, purpose, and profound love. They called her used goods and slashed her bride price, but a battle-scarred veteran had recognized her true worth, and in doing so, he had helped her recognize it herself.